She hadn't expected the line of questioning to take this turn. Was he accusing her of something? She didn't know, but she could feel a shift in the air, a subtle change that made her more anxious. Officer Stevens seemed to sense her discomfort, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to read her. "You know, people like you don't usually drive cars like this," he said, his voice colder now. Alicia froze. She didn't know if it was a veiled racist comment or if he was just trying to assert control, but something about it unsettled her. "I don't know what you mean by people like me," Alicia said, trying to remain composed. "But this car is mine, and I have every right to drive it." Stevens didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave her a sharp look, as if weighing his next move. The tension between them hung thick in the air. Alicia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. "Step out of the car, ma'am," Stevens suddenly ordered, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "I need to search your vehicle." Alicia was taken aback. Search her car? For what? She had done nothing wrong. She didn't feel comfortable with the situation at all, but she also didn't want to escalate things. She had heard stories of officers abusing their power, especially in small, quiet towns like this one. She glanced around, noticing a few houses in the distance, but no one was outside to witness what was happening. "I'd like to see a warrant before you search my car," Alicia said firmly, her voice now steadier despite the nerves building inside her. Stevens' jaw tightened. For a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes locked onto hers, and the silence between them grew unbearable. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he yanked open the car door. "Out of the car," he demanded, his voice sharp. Alicia hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do. The situation was escalating quickly, and she had no idea how to de-escalate it. She had no idea why this officer, who had no apparent reason to harass her, was so determined to make things difficult. But the reality of the moment hit her. She was powerless in the face of authority. And as much as she wanted to fight back, she knew the consequences could be far worse than just complying. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car. Officer Stevens took the keys from her, and in a voice that sent a chill down her spine, he said, "We'll see if you're in any position to make demands once I've got your car." Alicia's world seemed to slow down as he climbed into her car, his movements deliberate, and before she could protest again, he started the engine. The car roared to life, and as Stevens drove away, leaving Alicia standing alone in the middle of the road, her heart sank. It wasn't just the loss of her car that hurt. It was the powerlessness she felt in that moment, the undeniable fact that a man who had no reason to steal from her was doing just that. And there was nothing she could do to stop him. Alicia stood frozen on the side of the road, her heart racing as the sound of her car's engine faded into the distance. The sun, once a warm companion on her peaceful drive, now seemed distant and cold, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty street. Her legs felt like lead, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The officer had taken her car, the very symbol of everything she had worked for. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pockets, fumbling for her phone. She needed help, but the number she dialed felt like a lifeline that might slip away just as easily as her car had. The phone rang, and she forced herself to breathe as the line connected. "Hello," came the familiar voice of her friend Carla. "Carla." Alicia gasped, barely able to form the words. I need help. A cop just took my car. He pulled me over, said my registration was expired, and now he's driving away with it." There was a long pause on the other end, Carla's voice filled with confusion. "What? Are you okay? Is he letting you go?" "No," Alicia's voice cracked. "He's not. I tried to explain, but he didn't listen. I even asked him to show me a warrant before searching my car, but he just took the keys. He said he was going to check it out, and then he drove off like it was nothing. I don't know what to do, Carla." Carla's voice softened, filled with concern. "Alicia, that's insane. I'm coming right now. Don't move, okay?" Alicia nodded, even though Carla couldn't see her. She stared at the empty street where the officer had taken her car, still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Her stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was one thing to be treated unfairly, but this, it felt like an outright violation. No one had witnessed the event. No one had spoken up. The silence of the neighborhood felt suffocating. The officer's blatant abuse of power had left her without a voice, her sense of security shattered. As she waited for Carla to arrive, Alicia's mind raced. Was there something she had missed? Was she overreacting? The doubts gnawed at her, but deep down, she knew this wasn't about the car. It was about something far bigger, something that, despite the surreal nature of the situation, felt all too real. This was about the way people like her were treated. This was about the unspoken power dynamics, the ones that couldn't be challenged without fear of repercussions. Her car, her hard-earned luxury car, was taken without cause, without reason, and the officer hadn't even bothered to explain why. He had simply assumed control. Carla arrived moments later, her car pulling up to the curb where Alicia was standing, still staring at the empty road. Carla rolled down her window, her face a mix of concern and confusion. "Alicia, what happened? Did you call the police?" "I don't know what to do, Carla," Alicia muttered, sinking into the passenger seat of Carla's car. "I feel helpless. I didn't even do anything wrong. And now my car is gone. I've worked so hard for that, and he just took it like it was nothing." "Don't worry. We're going to figure this out," Carla reassured her. "We'll go to the station, report it. This isn't right, and they can't just take your car without a reason." But even as Carla spoke, Alicia felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. The powerlessness was overwhelming, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, it lingered. It wasn't just about getting her car back. It was about standing up against something far more dangerous, an abuse of authority that could have consequences far beyond her car. The drive to the police station felt long and silent, both women lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into the parking lot, Alicia's stomach twisted again. The building loomed ahead, imposing and cold. The thought of walking inside and confronting the officers who had been so quick to take her car filled her with a deep sense of dread. What if they didn't believe her? What if they sided with Stevens, covering up his actions, brushing it aside as just another mistake? They entered the station, and Alicia approached the front desk, trying to steady her nerves. The officer behind the counter barely looked up from his paperwork as she spoke. "Excuse me," Alicia began, her voice shaking just slightly. "I need to report that a police officer, Officer Stevens, took my car without cause. He pulled me over, said my registration was expired, and then took my keys. I need to file a complaint." The officer behind the counter looked up then, his expression unreadable. "Officer Stevens, he's out on patrol right now. I'll need to check on that, ma'am." Alicia's frustration flared. "I don't care where he is. I need to know what happened to my car. And I need it back. Now." The officer at the desk raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Alicia's tone. "Please wait here while I make a call. It'll only take a moment." As they waited, Alicia's thoughts spiraled. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her. She had done everything right, everything by the book. She had worked hard for her education, for her job, for her life. And yet it felt like none of that mattered. She was a young black woman in a world where her success seemed like something to be questioned, something to be scrutinized. The officer had seen her luxury car and assumed she didn't deserve it. She could feel the sting of that assumption deep in her chest, and it made her blood boil. What would have happened if she were someone else? If she weren't as composed? Would things have escalated further? Alicia turned to Carla, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does this feel like it's not just about the car? Why does it feel like he's trying to prove something? Like I'm being punished for having this car?" Carla nodded, her face reflecting a quiet understanding. "Because it's not just about the car. It's about power. And sometimes people abuse that power, Alicia. It's not right. But it happens all the time. Alicia's heart raced as she followed the officer, the tightness in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She could feel the dread building up inside her with every step. Her mind was swirling, a chaotic mix of thoughts. Her car, the one thing she had worked so hard for, was no longer just a symbol of success. It was the centerpiece of a nightmare that was unfolding too quickly for her to grasp. The officer led her toward the back of the station, where a couple of police cruisers were parked. As they turned the corner, Alicia's eyes locked onto a familiar sight. Her car. But it was no longer the pristine, sleek machine she had lovingly taken care of. It was battered, the front end crumpled, the hood dented in a way that suggested a high-speed collision. The once shiny black paint was marred with scratches and dirt from the accident. Alicia's breath caught in her throat. "Is this?" she asked, her voice shaky, barely able to believe what she was seeing. The officer nodded gravely. "Yes, ma'am. It was found crashed into a tree about 2 miles from here. The officer who took your vehicle, Stevens, was involved. He's been injured." Alicia's world tilted on its axis. The anger she had been holding in suddenly gave way to a deep, sickening disbelief. Officer Stevens, the same man who had taken her car in the first place, had wrecked it. It was one thing to have her car stolen by someone who didn't care about the consequences. But now, the situation felt personal. He hadn't just taken something from her. He had put it in harm's way. Without thinking, Alicia rushed to the car, her hands trembling as she placed them on the dented fender. The cold metal beneath her fingertips felt like a slap in the face, as though everything she had worked for was slipping away with every second. A wave of frustration and helplessness washed over her. She had been wronged. But this was something different. This wasn't just about a stolen car anymore. This was about a man with power, abusing it. And now, the consequences were spilling over, not only affecting her but the officer as well. "Is he okay?" Alicia finally managed to ask, her voice hollow. The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "He's been taken to the hospital. He was injured but conscious when they found him. We're still waiting on the full report." Alicia stood there for a moment, staring at the wrecked car, her emotions in a whirlwind. Part of her felt vindicated. This was karma, right? The officer who had stolen her car had now been forced to face the consequences of his own reckless actions. But the other part of her that had been raised to believe in justice, in the idea that the law was there to protect people, felt something else. Pity. Pity for Stevens. Despite the obvious wrongs he had done to her, despite the way he had humiliated her and taken what was hers without any reason, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy for him. He was a man who had clearly overestimated his power, thinking that his badge could shield him from everything. But now, that same badge had led him to a hospital bed, bruised and broken, while Alicia stood there, holding the remnants of the car that had symbolized her dreams. The officer beside her cleared his throat, snapping her out of her thoughts. "You'll need to make a statement for the record. We'll file a report, but I suggest you also consider pressing charges against Officer Stevens. His actions were highly inappropriate, and now this crash complicates the situation further." Alicia nodded, her mind still processing the enormity of the situation. Press charges? How could she? She wanted to. She wanted to take action, to make sure that Stevens faced the consequences for what he had done. But as she stood there, looking at her car, the whole thing felt surreal. How could she have known this would happen? How could anyone predict that the same officer who had stolen her car would end up in the hospital, having destroyed it in the process? It was almost as if the universe had conspired to turn the tables on him, but at what cost? She swallowed hard, trying to steady her thoughts. The anger was still there, but beneath it was something else, a sense of powerlessness. The kind of powerlessness that comes when the system you trust fails you. And it wasn't just Stevens who had failed her. It was everyone who had let him get away with this kind of behavior. The very structure that had allowed him to treat her like she didn't matter. The injustice of it all made her blood boil. but she kept it in check. Her car was gone. There was no undoing that. But Stephen's recklessness had given her a chance to take a stand, to push back, to make sure that he wouldn't get away with this. For the first time, she realized that the fight wasn't just about her. It was about anyone who had been treated unfairly, anyone who had been silenced by someone in power. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last, but she would make sure her voice was heard. Alicia's eyes met the officer's, and she nodded with resolve. "I want to press charges." The officer seemed taken aback by her swift decision, but didn't argue. "Are you sure? This could escalate things. It could turn into a bigger issue, especially considering he's a police officer. There may be some backlash." "I'm sure," Alicia said firmly. "I don't care if he's an officer. What he did to me, what he did to my car, isn't right. He needs to face the consequences." The officer nodded, as if recognizing the weight of her words. "Understood. We'll take your statement, and we'll proceed from there." As they walked toward the station to make the formal report, Alicia's mind was still racing. She hadn't expected the situation to spiral into something so big. But now, standing at the crossroads of justice and revenge, she understood that this wasn't just about her car anymore. It was about taking back what was rightfully hers, and making sure that Stevens would never again misuse the power he thought he had. The next few days would be critical. It was all out of her hands now, but she was determined to see it through. The battle for justice had just begun, and Alicia was ready to fight for her right to be heard. The next few days were a blur for Alicia. She didn't expect things to happen quickly, but the intensity of everything weighed heavily on her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of her car, broken and battered. She couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had crept in when Stevens had taken it. And now, with everything in motion, that helplessness was slowly being replaced with a quiet but steady determination. She knew what she had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. It was one thing to press charges, but it was another to ensure that the system would actually hold Stevens accountable. The days that followed were filled with calls to her lawyer, meetings with the local authorities, and discussions with her community. Alicia was doing her best to stay composed, but the emotional toll of everything was taking its toll. Every time she saw someone in a police uniform, she felt a mix of fear and distrust. What if this whole system was corrupt? What if Stevens wasn't the only one? She thought about how quickly he had taken her car without question, and how the entire process had unfolded. His sense of entitlement had been glaring. How many other people had experienced something like this? How many had felt powerless in front of an officer who thought his badge made him untouchable? Carla, who had been her rock throughout this ordeal, was there every step of the way. She came to all of Alicia's meetings, offering comfort, support, and practical advice. But there were moments when Alicia could see the weight of the situation in her friend's eyes too. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what this situation represented. Carla understood the larger implications, and though she had always been there for Alicia, this felt like something that would impact them both in ways they hadn't yet fully grasped. Meanwhile, Stevens was recovering in the hospital, but the news of the accident was already beginning to make its rounds. The media picked up on the story quickly, and with it, the usual debates started to stir. Alicia could already hear the whispers of people trying to justify Stevens' actions, offering excuses for why he had made the choices he did. Some said it was a mistake, that everyone had their bad days, and others said it was just a freak accident, that it wasn't his fault. But Alicia knew better. She knew that the truth was much more complicated, and she wasn't about to let his actions slip by unchallenged. It was the local news that brought everything to a head. They reported that Stevens had been hospitalized after the crash and that he had been taken into custody for questioning. Alicia was relieved, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The system wasn't always kind to people like her, and she feared that Stevens would find some way to wiggle out of this, just as many officers had in the past. As she sat in her living room one evening, Carla by her side, she received a call that would change the course of everything. "Alicia, it's Detective Roberts. The voice on the other end said, "We finished gathering the details on the crash and the events leading up to it. We've spoken with several witnesses who were nearby when Stevens took your car. Some of them even caught the exchange on their phones. It's pretty damning, but we still need your statement." Alicia's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected things to move so quickly, but the thought of everything coming to light filled her with both fear and relief. It meant that Stevens was in deep trouble, but it also meant that she was now part of a much bigger story. A story that wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, but about the broader issue of police accountability. "I'm ready," Alicia said, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling in her chest. "I'll come in." When Alicia arrived at the station, the energy in the room was different. There was a sense of urgency now, a sense that the situation had reached a breaking point. Detective Roberts briefed her on the details of what had happened after Stevens had left her on the side of the road. The witnesses who had filmed parts of the encounter had given statements that contradicted Stevens' version of events. They had caught snippets of him taunting Alicia before taking her car, some of them even calling out to him to stop. Alicia watched the videos, her eyes glued to the screen as she saw the arrogant officer, once so confident in his power, acting out, pushing his authority in ways that were hard to ignore. He had been clearly trying to provoke her, egging her on as though she were nothing more than a pawn in his little game. The footage was damning. It painted Stevens as a man who had let power corrupt him, who had used his position to intimidate and dominate. But then there was the moment that changed everything. The footage of the crash itself. It wasn't long after Stevens had sped off in her car, confident that he was in control. The footage showed the officer barreling through a red light, taking a sharp turn at an unsafe speed. The car skidded, slammed into a tree, and came to an abrupt stop. The video quality was shaky, but there was no mistaking the sound of the crash, the crunch of metal, and the final, heavy silence that followed. Stevens had crashed her car, and now, it was clear, it wasn't just a freak accident. He had been reckless, using his power to take what wasn't his, and in the process, he had put both himself and her car in danger. When the detective finished showing the footage, Alicia felt a surge of anger. Not only had Stevens stolen from her, but now he had ruined her car. But more than that, he had misused his power in a way that could not be justified. This wasn't a simple traffic violation. This was an abuse of authority. And now, with all the evidence in front of her, Alicia realized just how deep the rot ran. Stevens had used the badge to cover up his mistakes and manipulate situations for his own benefit. But now, the truth was out. Alicia signed her statement, knowing that what she was about to do would take her down a path she hadn't fully prepared for. Pressing charges was just the start. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving that no one, no matter their badge, no matter their position, was above the law. She didn't know how this would play out, but she was ready to see it through. What had started as a stolen car had now become a fight for justice, and she wasn't backing down. As she left the station, Carla was waiting outside. The relief on her face was unmistakable, but Alicia could see the concern still lingering in her eyes. "What's next?" Carla asked. "Now we wait," Alicia said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "But we're not done yet." They got into the car, and as they drove away from the station, Alicia couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long while, she was on the right side of something bigger than herself. This wasn't just about getting her car back. This was about making sure that no one else would have to endure what she had. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Alicia was ready to fight. The weeks that followed felt like a storm. Alicia had thought the worst was over once she'd made her statement, but the storm had only just begun to churn. The story had gained traction in the local media, and before long, it had snowballed into something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. The incident was no longer just about her and Stevens. It was about a community, a town torn between supporting an officer they had known for years and standing behind a young woman who had been wronged. The media coverage was relentless, but the attention wasn't always kind. Some supported Alicia, calling her brave for standing up against a system they felt was failing the community. Others, however, painted Stevens as the victim, claiming that he had made a mistake, that no one intended for things to escalate the way they had. The whispers in the town were inevitable. As Alicia's face began to appear in the papers, some people she had known her whole life began to distance themselves. Her phone rang less, and she found herself fielding countless calls from reporters eager to get a soundbite or a quote. Her once peaceful neighborhood now felt hostile, and the anger she'd initially felt was slowly replaced by something even more painful: loneliness. It wasn't just that people were questioning her version of events. It was the deep-rooted feeling that, no matter how much she fought, there would always be people who would defend Stevens, who would see him as the real victim in all of this. But Alicia had made a promise to herself, and there was no going back. She had seen the footage of the crash. She had listened to the testimony of the witnesses. She knew what had happened. And if there was one thing she had learned over the past few weeks, it was that sometimes the truth didn't matter to everyone. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for. One evening, as Alicia sat in her living room, scrolling through her phone, her thoughts were interrupted by a call. It was Detective Roberts. He was calling with news that both shocked and brought a sense of dread. The department had decided to launch an internal investigation into Officer Stevens. The evidence from the crash was damning, and with the public outcry continuing to grow, they couldn't ignore it any longer. Stevens had been suspended without pay while the investigation took place. But while that was a step forward, the detective warned her that things could still drag out. Internal investigations in police departments were often slow, and the officer's friends and colleagues might try to cover for him. Alicia's stomach twisted as she listened. She had expected Stevens to be punished, but hearing it from Roberts felt like a hollow victory. Suspension wasn't the same as accountability. Stevens had wrecked her car and taken away her peace of mind. And now his fate was in the hands of the very system that had enabled him. Would he get off easy? Would they sweep this under the rug, as they had so many times before? The question gnawed at her. That night, Alicia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, thinking about all the people in her life who had given her advice. Carla, her family, even strangers who had reached out in support. They all wanted her to see this through, that the weight of the decision, the enormity of what she was up against, had never been clearer. The following morning, as Alicia drove to the police station for another meeting, something unexpected happened. A car, a nondescript sedan, pulled up alongside her at a red light. Alicia glanced over, startled to see Officer Stevens sitting in the passenger seat, looking out the window at her. It wasn't the first time she had seen him since the crash, but this encounter felt different. His eyes locked onto hers for a moment, and for the first time, Alicia saw something unfamiliar in them, a mix of shame and guilt. He didn't say anything, but there was a look in his eyes that told her more than any words could have. The light turned green, and the car sped away, leaving Alicia standing there, unsure of what to make of the moment. That was when it hit her. Stevens was not untouchable. He was human. He had made a mistake, a colossal one, and now it was coming back to haunt him. Alicia had spent so much time focusing on the injustice of what had happened, the way Stevens had taken from her, that she had never stopped to consider what the weight of his actions must be like for him. He had ruined his career, his reputation, and for what? To prove a point. To feel powerful for a few moments. Alicia realized, in that brief glance, that Stevens was no longer the man with power. He was the man who had lost everything, and soon the world would know the full extent of his actions. Later that day, as she met with Detective Roberts, she made a decision. "I want to take this further," she said. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. I don't want Stevens to be the only one who faces consequences. If there's a system in place that lets officers like him act without accountability, I want to make sure it changes." Roberts looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You sure? Taking this public, pushing for systemic change. It's going to make things a lot harder. Stevens might be the target right now, but the system's not going to let that go easily. Unsure, Alicia said, her voice steady. I didn't ask for this, but I'm not going to let it go. I want to make sure people see the bigger picture. The detective didn't respond right away. He just nodded, as though he were seeing something in Alicia that had been buried beneath the surface all along. A quiet resolve. All right, Alicia. You've got my support. But be prepared. This won't be easy. Alicia nodded, her determination stronger than ever. She had started this journey to reclaim what had been taken from her, but now, it wasn't just about her. It was about creating change, about holding the system accountable, about making sure no one else would have to experience what she had. She had become something more than just a victim. She was a voice, and no matter how hard the road ahead would be, Alicia was ready to walk it. The days that followed were full of meetings with community leaders, press conferences, and interviews. Alicia became a reluctant symbol of resistance, her face plastered across local news channels and newspapers. She found herself at the center of a whirlwind she hadn't asked for, but one she was more than willing to face. She wasn't just fighting for justice in her case. She was fighting for something bigger, something that would ripple through her community, and hopefully beyond it. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, to everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. It was a story of resistance, of standing up and saying, "This is not okay. This cannot continue." Through it all, one thing became clear. Alicia had found her purpose, and she wasn't backing down. Weeks turned into months, and the fallout from the incident continued to reverberate through Alicia's life. What had started as a personal tragedy had blossomed into a movement of sorts, one that grew far beyond the boundaries of her small town. Alicia had found herself thrust into the role of an unintentional leader, a voice for those who had been silenced, ignored, or unjustly treated by the very systems meant to protect them. But despite the newfound purpose that seemed to fill her every step, the weight of it all often felt overwhelming. In the months following the crash, Stevens had become a ghost. The internal investigation into his actions moved at a glacial pace, and while the media continued to cover the case, it had lost its immediate urgency. The public seemed to grow bored with the story, shifting their attention to the next scandal, the next outrage. But for Alicia, the pain hadn't dulled. Her car was still gone, though insurance had reimbursed her. That wasn't the point. What had been stolen from her couldn't be replaced with a check. The sense of betrayal, the quiet humiliation of being targeted for reasons beyond her control, lingered in ways she hadn't anticipated. But she pushed forward. She had made a promise to herself, and she would see it through to the end. She would not let the story be forgotten, would not let Stevens get away with it, would not let the system continue to fail the vulnerable. There was a pivotal moment, a day Alicia would remember for the rest of her life, when she was invited to speak at a town hall meeting about police accountability. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked to share her story, but this was different. This wasn't just a group of activists or journalists. It was the people who ran her town, the ones with the power to make decisions, to change laws, to hold officers accountable. The town hall meeting was being held to discuss the growing public demand for police reform, sparked in no small part by the attention Alicia's case had garnered. And there, in front of a packed room of elected officials, law enforcement officers, and local citizens, Alicia stood at the podium, ready to speak her truth. As she looked out at the sea of faces before her, she felt a wave of vulnerability crash over her. Some of these people knew her, others didn't. Some would stand with her, others would fight against what she was saying. The thought was terrifying, but there was no turning back. She had been thrust into this position for a reason. She had to use her voice, or else all of this would have been for nothing. With a deep breath, Alicia began. "I didn't want any of this," she said, her voice steady but strong. "I didn't ask for this fight. I didn't ask to be the face of anything. I didn't ask for my car to be stolen, for my life to be turned upside down. But I'm here today because I can't just walk away. I'm here today because no one should ever have to go through what I went through. I'm here today because it's not just about one officer who made a mistake. It's about a system that allows it to happen over and over again. And that system needs to change." The room was silent as Alicia's words hung in the air. She could feel the weight of the moment settle over her. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was speaking for all the people who had been wronged, all the ones who had been afraid to speak out. She was speaking for those who had been treated as though their lives didn't matter, their voices didn't count. "I want to make one thing clear," she continued, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the gazes of both allies and skeptics. "This isn't about one bad cop. It's about the culture that allows that bad cop to thrive. It's about the broken trust between the police and the communities they're supposed to protect. It's about accountability. It's about justice. And if we want to make real change, we need to stop pretending this is just a few isolated incidents. We need to ask ourselves, how many more people have to suffer before we actually do something?" Alicia paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. The room was still. For a brief moment, it felt as though everything had come to a standstill. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to nod. Some were hesitant, others were more resolute. But the message was clear. The conversation was shifting. The town hall meeting didn't end with a resolution. In fact, it didn't even end with a clear plan of action. But it was a step forward. People were listening. Alicia had made her point, and she knew the fight was far from over. But she had given the community something important. A spark, a reason to question, a reason to demand change. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The weeks following that meeting were full of legal battles and public scrutiny. The investigation into Stevens dragged on, with internal affairs dragging their feet and offering no clear timeline for resolution. Alicia's lawyer, however, was relentless. They filed a lawsuit, seeking damages for the loss of her vehicle and for the emotional distress she had endured. Stevens, though suspended, had not been charged with any crime related to the incident. And Alicia knew, as much as the system was failing her, she couldn't give up. And then, one day, out of nowhere, came the letter. Alicia sat down at her kitchen table, eyes scanning the envelope. It was from the police department. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it an update? A resolution? She tore it open, her hands trembling. It wasn't what she had expected. It was a letter from the chief of police himself, acknowledging the department's failures and, more importantly, the systemic issues that had allowed Stevens to operate as he had. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was the first real sign that something was changing. The chief offered an apology, stating that they would be implementing reforms to improve accountability and transparency. Stevens would be facing disciplinary action, though it wasn't clear what that would entail. Alicia felt a strange mix of emotions. She was glad that Stevens was being held accountable, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about him. It was about the broader system that had allowed him to misuse his power in the first place. But it was a start. It was progress. And that, for now, was enough. The fight wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would be difficult. But Alicia had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had stood on the side of the road, helpless as her car was stolen. She had found her voice, and she had learned that even the smallest of voices could change the course of history. And no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, she would keep fighting, because justice, for her and for everyone who had been wronged, was worth fighting for. As Alicia sat in her kitchen, staring at the letter, she couldn't help but think of all the people who had supported her along the way, her family, her friends, and the strangers who had reached out. They had all believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself, and that was the strength she would carry with her from here on out. What's next? Carla had asked her, back when things first started to spiral. Alicia smiled softly as she looked at the letter. Next, she whispered to herself, we keep going.